230 years later, we're struggling at all levels of this American dream.
Okay. It's not a simple question. I mean, the most important thing is we had the mother of all financial crises. Or actually, I guess the stepmother of all financial crises, because the mother was in the 1930s, but this was a pretty close second to it. It takes a long time to recover from those, even with the best policies, which we did not have. We did everything that we were not supposed to do. We cut government spending too quickly. We failed to have sufficiently aggressive monetary policies. So it's been a long hangover, although, compared with any place else in the advanced world, the U.S. economy looks pretty good right now. And then, well, we've actually generated quite a lot of wealth in this country over the past 30 years. We haven't grown nearly as fast as we did in the post-war 30 years, but we've done not too badly by many measures, except that not much of it has trickled down to ordinary working families. And so we've had a situation where rapidly rising inequality has meant that many people don't share in what has actually been a fairly decent growth in productivity and production.
But Steve, your point of view on what's happened, why don't we have this American dream today?
So you were hoping, Paul, Mark, that Paul and I would have some sources of agreement, and I think already we do. I agree that just about everything that we've done in Washington for the last 7 years has been exactly the wrong thing to do, right? And we've made the economy much worse. It's not just under Barack Obama, but under George Bush. I think that the bailouts were a mistake. I think the bailouts of the banks and the financial institutions, which have created, I think, a great moral hazard to the economy going forward. We're seeing a centralization of the banks. I think that the massive $830 billion stimulus plan was a massive mistake that did not create jobs. I think Obamacare was a mistake. I think the tax increases on the rich were a mistake. I think the cash for punkers were a mistake. It's hard to see just about anything that has gone right. And if you wouldn't mind, can we show that one of my charts? Mark, I don't know how we do this, but can you put up?
Yeah, one of the Steve Moore charts.
It's the first or second chart. So go forward, not that one. Okay, so this is, and I love Paul's response to this because, look, we did have a massive amount of spending. We did have a massive amount of debt. We've increased the national debt by $7 trillion over the last 6 years. So that was, that was a big Keynesian experiment, any way you want to cut it or look at it. And this is one of my favorite charts, which just shows, Paul is right, that when Barack Obama took office, he entered office during a period of great economic crisis. It started Ronald Reagan, and we all remember what happened in the late 1970s when we had 20% mortgage interest rates and 14% inflation, and every economist of the day was saying that America was in permanent decline. And these two presidents used entirely different approaches to dealing with the crisis. Reagan's philosophy, to put it in one sentence, was the government is not the solution, government is the problem. And Obama's philosophy, to sort of simplify it, is the government really is the solution to a lot of our problems. And this is just kind of interesting. If we had the same kind of recovery that we had under Reagan, under Barack Obama, we'd have $2.75 trillion more GDP today. And we'd have that every single year. And I think the Keynesians and I think people like Paul Krugman need to have an answer to that. And I don't think it's a good answer to say.
I think I need to.
Let me just show one more chart. Then, God. I mean, this is the jobs problem. And this is a major, major problem. We have well over 8 million fewer jobs today than we would have if we had the kind of recovery.
The question is, Paul, is this Obama's and the Democrats, are they the ones responsible for this, or is it George W. Bush who created the problem in the first place?
Okay, none of the above. Let me speak clear. And let me get my charts also.
Okay.
And I'll probably end up referring to it a few times as we go along here. But let me just, while we're waiting for that to happen, let me just say that the recession of 1981-82 and the recession, so next slide after that, the recession after of 2008-2009 were very, very different beasts. The first one was brought about because the Federal Reserve wanted to bring down inflation, and it raised interest rates sky high. And then, after they felt that the economy has suffered enough. They brought interest rates way down, and so you have a rapid recovery. The 2008-2009 took place not because inflation was high, it was not, but because we had a financial system that ran out of control and crashed. And the Fed tried to cut interest rates, but it ran up against the problem that you can't cut interest rates below zero. And that meant that it was a very, very different story. It was bound to be a much slower and much more difficult recovery, even with the right policies, which is not 20/20 hindsight. I was writing about this over and over again, saying that this was going to be a sluggish recovery. It was predictably true. It was just, I have to say, it's really kind of depressing to see people holding up the Reagan story, which is so obviously different if you pay any attention to the story, as that's the best argument. That's the best argument. I just want to show you, this is,
what is it?
you can take it.
Complex.
It isn't really. One of the big problems that you have in all of these discussions is people go around and they tell you a story about this country or that time or whatever. I try, just as, you want to be sure that you aren't picking your examples. You aren't cherry picking. This is for all advanced countries for every year over this period of 2010 to 2013, which is when countries were making very different responses. Some were imposing really harsh austerities, some were not. Comparing the rate of growth of government spending in any individual country and year with the rate of growth of GDP. And what it says is that if you don't cherry pick, if you look at all the data, what you find is an obvious, strong, positive correlation in recent years between government spending and growth. And anyone who wants to say that, well, we did the wrong thing by not cutting spending more, that we did too much stimulus, has to say, well, how is it that how do you explain? This is the reality. The reality is one that is very, very Keynesian, just looking across the world. That's what the data look like.
All here, the growth led to higher government spending, or do you think it's the other way? How do you know which way it's going?
That's a very good question. That's the reason why I restrict myself to this period, which is the period when government spending changes were very much dictated by austerity questions, by some countries that were forced to do massive cuts in spending and others not. And so, if you were going to look at countries that are in that northeast quadrant, would include places like Germany, or the United States actually, which at least were not forced into severe austerity. Countries in the southwest quadrant are the ones you can guess. So, yeah, of course, there's a reason for choosing that period. The Obama stimulus, by the way, again, when you say gigantic stimulus, we have a $17 trillion a year economy. You had an $800 billion stimulus spread over 3 years. It maxed out at about 2% of GDP. It was not a huge program. And again, this is not 20/20 hindsight. I was tearing my hair out repeatedly on the pages of the New York Times saying this is a vastly inadequate stimulus. And it actually did. The U.S. economy did start to resume growth as the stimulus kicked in, but that's not the problem. The problem was that it wasn't enough. And one of the questions we had since I did advance to show me a successful example of stimulus is hard to do because nobody ever does it really on the scale that's required when it's needed.
Now, before